Welcome to Wisco Legacy. I'm your host, Corey Kundert. On Wisco Legacy, we talk to inspiring Wisconsinites to hear all about their life's journey. Jeff Ditzenberger joins Wisco Legacy this week to talk about TUGS, a nonprofit he started around mental health. TUGS stands for Talking, Understanding, Growing, and Supporting. Jeff's had some trying times in his life. He's had a couple divorces. He was in the Navy and has some PTSD from that time. He had an attempted suicide when he was younger. All these trying times were lessons learned for Jeff, and he's able to utilize what he's learned through those lessons to help in his work that he does with TUGS. If you like Wisco Legacy, head on out to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the podcast out there. Also head out to whatever podcast platform you're listening to and follow us and rate us and review us there. We're also on YouTube. Every week we have a video version that's up on YouTube, so go out there and hit subscribe as well. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Head out there and follow us as well. With all that said, let's dive on into episode 26 of Wisco Legacy with Jeff Ditzenberger.
Hi, I'm Jeff Ditzenberger. I'm the president and founder of TUGS, which stands for Talking, Understanding, Growing, and Supporting, and this is my Wisco Legacy.
And really excited to talk to you today, Jeff. Welcome to Wisco Legacy.
Thanks. I don't have a lot of people tell me that they're excited to talk to me, Corey, so I'm actually kind of glad that this early on a Sunday morning. That's kind of cool. So
yeah. All right. So you grew up. Your roots are in agriculture. You grew up on a farm in South Wayne. Can you talk about growing up on the farm and what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, just a small dairy farm in South Wayne. We milked like 50 cows, a couple hundred acres. Dad and Grandpa and my uncle farmed together for quite a while and then kind of went on their own. Small town. I think South Wayne's got like 465 people except on the weekends, and I think it's like 430. Went through high school at Blackhawk. Was really good at public speaking, enjoyed my FFA time, wasn't really big into sports. Us farm kids, we were always, shoveling calf pens or throwing hay bales around, stuff like that. So, and I was short and small. I'm still kind of short, depending on who you talk to, but, wasn't really actively involved in sports. I was more of the groupie type stuff with the, chorus and that kind of stuff. Was an only child until I was 10. And then mom and dad one morning at 6:30 in the morning before chores told me they were going to give me a playmate. And I thought I was getting a dog. Apparently I was getting a little brother. Then I had to start sharing my grandparents and my parents and everything with him. And that was just a whole nother story in itself, but pretty, it was, to go from that to shortly after graduation to go to the military, where there was as many people on my ship as there was in my hometown, kind of a huge culture shock.
Yeah, what was that experience like to go from being on the dairy farm to the Navy there?
Well, and I kind of got away from the farm because I wanted to get rid. Parents have all these things called rules and stuff. And I'm like, I want to be an adult, whatever. So at 17 and a half, I actually enlisted in the United States Navy. And I was the third generation. My grandfather was in, my dad was in. So when I told my grandfather I wanted to go in the Army, he didn't really say anything rude about it. But he was kind of like, well, you can do what you want, Sonny, but we haven't had anybody in the Army before. And I was like, well, that's kind of an indication where he wanted me to go. But I will never forget, Corey, that first day at boot camp. Like, how you see in the movies, like when they throw the trash cans down the center and they're like, they say things I can't say on this podcast, but, I kind of wanted to crawl in the fetal position. I'm like, maybe mom and dad's place wasn't so bad after all. You're thrown in with a whole bunch of people you've never met before. I think there was like 65 or 70 in our company, which is interesting because I think my graduating class had like 55, or less even the more I think about it. But, I actually got to be around my first, Black people, Mexicans, people of all races and color. When you come from a town like South Wayne, I never saw any of that kind of stuff. And not that I had an issue with it, but all of a sudden here you are thrown into the whole mix of everything, and you're 17 and a half, and you think you got the world by the tail, and then all of a sudden someone yanks the tail away from you. It was a big culture shock. Got through boot camp, actually did really well actually in boot camp. And then went to Philadelphia for ACE school. And what ACE school is basically just a school that for whatever your rate's going to be. I was a welder, plumber, pipe fitter, damage control person, firefighter. So went out to Philadelphia, another huge culture shock. Now I'm in the service with different nationalities, different races. We had quite a few females that were in our school, who, by the way, were the best welders I've ever met in my entire life. So there was that part of it. Great Lakes was big enough, but then you get to Philadelphia and it's like a whole nother new world. And I'd never been in big cities like that on my own before. And then shortly after that, ended up in California and ended up on the ship that I eventually did my 3 years worth of military experience on.
Wow. Did you get deployed anywhere during that time frame?
Yeah, actually we did. We did a Westpac, so Westpac is a Western Pacific. Got to see Australia and Japan. Got off the coast of Russia. We got to see quite a few ports. And then we were on our way back home, and the Gulf War broke out. And the ship that was supposed to replace us couldn't pass their qualifications, which, some of us joke they just didn't want to, because, the thing you got to remember about my ship, Corey, is my ship was about the size of South Wayne, people-wise and displacement-wise, but all we carried was ammunition, diesel fuel, and jet fuel. And I even remember saying to one of the chiefs one day, I'm like, how come there's like no other ships around us when we're floating around out here? And he's like, well, we're kind of a big floating time bomb. So, everybody's 25 miles away because the hole would be 20 miles, and then the repercussions after that would be like another 5 miles, and nobody wants to capsize a big ship, obviously. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And the thing is like when I talk about, some of the PTSD and stuff that I suffer from that came military related, like what I don't think a lot of people understand on that side of it is that you don't have to be boots on the ground with an M16 to experience some of the stuff. I love it when I give speeches and I'll ask, especially when with a younger, I can't believe there's even a younger generation to me now. But anyways, when I ask that younger generation, like, how many of you have seen the Scuds get blown out of the sky on TV and stuff in school, for social studies and history, and all these hands go up. And I'm like, yeah, I saw that from like, miles off of the shore. So, there was a huge stressor there that I wouldn't wish on anybody. But yeah, that was my last deployment. And then I came back and came back to Wisconsin.
Yeah. So you're in the military for how long? 4 years. 4 years. Okay. What was your transition like out? Because I know a lot of military folks struggle with that transition and finding their identity.
It was. I had to finally mess my bed up in the morning because I was still doing military corners, and I was folding my laundry exactly the way it was and stuff. And if my mother happens to listen to this, she'll be like, "Well, you never did that for me." But it was the structure was still there, Corey, but the wanting to destroy that structure was kind of like inside. But every time you did it, you felt like you were doing something against rules and regulations. And so it wasn't a terrible transition by any means, because 4 years really isn't that much of a time frame, but it was enough to where I had to move cups in the cupboard just so you didn't have that that consistency. And then shortly thereafter, I just became a complete rebel, and I didn't do anything along that lines. But I don't know. It wasn't terrible, but there was definitely, I remember them. They even let us take this class. Like before we get out, they give you this class to kind of transition back in, and I was still saying yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, a lot, and some of that stuff. But other than that, it wasn't too terrible. It was kind of nice to be able to like open up the door to your house and walk out on dry land and go do whatever you want instead of, opening up a door and seeing nothing but blue ocean for as far as the eye could see. And if you stepped off of that front deck, then they were going to have to turn the ship around, come pick your sorry butt up because you were a man overboard. So
yeah. Wow. So can you walk us through your career a bit? I know you spent a lot of time in the agriculture space. Can you just walk us through what you've done over the years?
So when I first got back from the service, I worked for a alfalfa cubing company. They took alfalfa, made it into little cubes for like rabbits and gerbils and stuff like that here in Monroe. And then shortly after that, I started working at a wastewater treatment plant and helping a farmer at the same time. And then I had my suicide attempt during that part when and I'm sure we'll get to this more, but then I had lost the one job before my suicide attempt, lost the other one the night after my suicide attempt, and then I started working while I was incarcerated on Huber. I worked for John Roof over at Roof's Farm Service as a technician. From there, I went to Studer's, and Freddie Studer, for whatever reason, him and Louie saw something in me after about a year and took me from taking out trash and doing parts to putting me in sales. Was there for about 7-8 years, about 6 years. And then John Deere here in Monroe made me an offer, and I was there until they got bought out. And I was with the new company for about 4 years, and they kept doing budget cuts. And by budget cuts, I mean anybody that was with the old dealership slowly got walked to the door. And I think part of the problem was that it was more of a corporate structure, and those of us that are part of I hate to use the term good old boy club, that wasn't the way that we did business. I mean, we wanted to talk to people. We wanted to see people face to face. We wanted to help people, our farmers and our customers. We wanted to help them with their challenges on the farm, with their equipment needs and stuff like that. And that was kind of taken away from it. And then after that, I went to Carter and Grindelwald for about 8 or 9 months, but it just wasn't the speed that I like. Anybody will tell you I go 120 miles an hour all the time. So I started with a marketing firm called Fastline. I was a marketing representative for about half the state of Wisconsin for all the farm equipment dealerships in the area. And all the time that I'm doing this too, Corey, like there was always a farmer here, farmer there. Got remarried. Actually, the gal that I was married to, we farmed together for 16 years, dairy farm, crop farm. And then after Fastline, I went to Johnson Tractor, and it was another one of those times in my life where I kind of lost sight of myself. I kind of became an arrogant jackass. Got into a little bit of some trouble there, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, I'm sure. And then farmed with a neighbor, an old neighbor of my ex-wife and mine. I've been farming with him for the last 6 years. And then just recently, I've accepted a position as the district manager for Wisconsin with Big Iron Online Auctions. So I'm doing that now, it's kind of nice to be back in the machinery side of it. I'm still going to help Rich with crops but it's we've cut way back on the acreage that we had and stuff. So it was just, it couldn't have come at a better time. I showed Rich what they wanted me to do and what they were offering me, and he jokingly said, "Well, if you don't take it, I'm going to call him as soon as you leave the house." So, but he's kind of at that point where he's, kind of thinking about maybe retiring or having somebody else do some stuff. So yeah, but as you can tell, from the time that I fed my first calf at age 5 until I got on this podcast with you this morning, my hands have been in something agriculture related that entire time.
Absolutely. It's definitely a passion of yours for sure. So you mentioned some challenges you've had along the way. You've been divorced. You had an attempted suicide. You've had some other things that have happened in your life. Do you want to talk about some of the challenges you've had and how you've kind of learned and grown from those challenges?
So when I first got out of the military, the transition wasn't hard, but I kind of had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. I don't even really know how to describe it or where I got that from, but I so there was some things going on in my marriage at that time already, to the gal that I was married to at the time. I found out that I had been cheated on numerous times, um, and that was probably the first moment or the first time in my adult life that I was like, oh my god, I'm kind of starting to hate myself. Like I was having these thoughts and I was having these episodes, for lack of a better term, and that's when I was first introduced to, trying to talk to my guy friends about what was going on in my head and wanting to talk to somebody. And it was the, oh, man up, dude, or oh, suck it up, buttercup. Suck it up, buttercup. It's not that big of a deal. People have it worse than you, or it's, just all this. I already had negative feelings as it was, Corey. And now, people are bringing in this negativity on top of it, and there's a thing we talk about nowadays called toxic positivity, which some of them did that too. They're like, oh, tomorrow will be better. I don't know that. You don't know that. So it just, I felt like what was going on in my head wasn't getting validated, and so that made me even more frustrated with what was going on. um uh and then the company that I was working for at the time, which was Sylvester Way Products, they were doing some things from the wastewater treatment plant that were not on the up and up. And anyways, it was about 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. DNR showed up at my house, knocked on my front door, and they were like, "Hey, we need to have a conversation with you," and I was like, okay, what did I do? Whatever. So then they started talking about this. And of course, I wasn't going to lie about it because, I've got 3 DNR agents and, some other high powered people in there. And it was probably 2 or 3 days later, I went back to work because I was on a 7-day on, 7-day off schedule. And I went back to work, and the owners pulled me into the office, and they were like, so, you might be getting a visit from the DNR. And I was like, already did get a visit from the DNR. And they're like, well, what'd you tell them? I said, well, I told them exactly what was going on. And they're like, well, tell us what you told. And I told, basically what I'd said. And 4 hours later, they were coming down to my office, packing my stuff and walking me to the door.
Wow.
So I had turned to my good friends Jack and Jose and the captain and a few others in this time frame too. Like I didn't drink at all in high school. Like I wasn't one of those people, and it wasn't really like I wasn't cool enough to be invited to parties, so I wasn't really exposed to it. Occasionally, like after a full day in the Haymow or something, Dad might let us boys, sip on a little beer. And we thought we were pretty cool. And after about 3 sips, we were like, "Ooh, that's enough." But I started to kind of kill some of this pain with alcohol. I was trying to get into see a counselor. And keep in mind, Corey, this is back in '92, and it was like 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks to get in to see somebody. The insurance racket behind it was just absolutely ludicrous, which drove a person even crazier, for lack of a better term. So obviously, booze is pretty readily available. So I became a raging alcoholic, to the point where I was putting whiskey in my coffee thermos before I'd go to work. I'd have lunch. I'd go out and have a couple of beers. On the way home, I'd grab a 12-pack or a case of something or a bottle of something, and the next morning it would be gone. So I decided I started planning my suicide about 6 weeks before I actually attempted it. And that's one of the first things I want to say when it comes to the stigma behind mental health and suicide, is that people think, a lot of people think it's a rash decision, like you're not thinking clearly and all this other stuff. I mean, I wrote my letter, and it took me probably the better part of 3-4 weeks to write my letter. I went and saw people, and gave away some of my guns, gave away some of my, most prized possessions, and when I would leave, people would say, oh, see you later, Ditz. And I'm like, nah, probably not, and nobody did anything. Nobody, like these are all classic signs, nobody did anything in regards to that. And I remember, excuse me, I remember writing my letter. And part of my letter was mad. Like, I told everybody who didn't give me the time of day, that didn't want to talk to me about my problems, like the big F you, asking my grandparents for forgiveness because, I couldn't, I wasn't strong enough to keep going. My baby brother is one of the most important people in my life. Like, I, apologized to him in this letter and whatnot. And so the night that I decided to do this, I had thrown my mom a surprise birthday party, and my dad and I drank together that night. And the interesting thing is that I was on the volunteer fire department at the time, and my pager went off, or so I thought. And I took my wife home, dropped her off, said thanks for everything, see you later, and went to an old abandoned house and went inside this old abandoned house and started it on fire. And that's how I was going to end my life. Now, disclaimer, yes, I realize there's easier ways to do this that are less painful. Two, I kind of laugh at the irony, and I'll let people, the listeners that are listening to this, I tell everybody who I give my speeches to, like, the irony of writing a note on a piece of paper and putting it in your pocket of your jeans and then walking into a burning building is kind of counterproductive, just for the record. So, I for a serious subject, yes, it's serious, but at the same time, I'm just like, that's really dumb. Like, that when nobody would have gotten my message. Like, everything, there would have been all these unanswered questions and so on and so forth. So I went in to the house, started on fire. The next thing, and keep in mind, back in the day, Corey, I didn't remember a lot of this stuff for a while, but through therapy and everything else, a lot of this stuff has finally come through. But next thing I know, I'm like, what the hell am I doing in this burning house? And I went next door, dialed 911, went to the call with the fire department. And luckily there was one of our captains who saw something wasn't right. The next morning I get a phone call from the sheriff's department, and they're like, hey, we think that you've got some information in regards to this fire last night. Can you come into the station? I'm like, well, yeah, I want to help out. I'm more than happy to do that. And as I was getting ready to leave, the guy that I was milking cows for called me, and he says, hey, did you milk so-and-so? And I'm like, that's one of my favorite cows. So yeah, of course I did. And he's like, well, it doesn't look like it. And we don't want you here anymore. You need to pack it. So now I've lost my second job within 2 weeks. The problem with this job is that my housing was part of my wage. So now I've just lost my house on top of it. Go into the sheriff's department and talk to Sergeant Pepper. That's his real name. I hope he hears this. Him and I have actually have reconnected over the years, and I always gave him a hard time about him being called Sergeant Pepper. And for those of you that are really young, there was a band that was called Sergeant Pepper. So anyways, when I'm sitting across from the desk from him, he goes, well, we think that you started this fire. And I'm like, there's no way. What the hell, And he goes, well, he says, I'm going to give you two choices. You can either go to the psychiatric unit or you can go to jail. Probably one of the best decisions I have ever made in my life, Corey, was going to the psychiatric unit. Okay. Now, we all know how Hollywood portrays the psychiatric unit. We know how, way back when, they used to call the psychiatric units, they used to call them an insane asylum. And asylum itself is a safe word. Like, it's a positive word. Like, asylum is someplace where you're supposed to feel safe, where you're supposed to, be at peace, have some help. And, when you think about modern day society and what we've seen on Hollywood and the way, nobody wants to go see a shrink. Nobody wants to go to the loony bin. That's where all the crazy people are, so on and so forth. And I will never forget the people that I met when I was in the psychiatric unit. And I will never forget that for one of the first times in a long time, I didn't feel judged for what was going on in my head. However, so at this point, I'm like, I don't want anybody to know that I tried to kill myself. And so went through a 3-day emergency hold at the psychiatric unit. They took me out in cuffs, which is one of the most embarrassing things I've ever had to do. Took me to the courthouse and charged me with felony arson. So here's a volunteer firefighter who's a veteran, who fought fires in the military, who is now being charged with felony arson. Front page of the newspaper, I mean, everybody knew about it, all over WEKZ, and I made a decision, though, Corey, that at that time I was less embarrassed to be charged with a felony than I was to admit that I had tried to kill myself 5 nights earlier.
Wow.
There was less stigma with that than to come back and say, oh no, I've got, and it was still frustrating. I went home for about 4 days, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. And I actually checked myself back into the psychiatric unit and was there for, I think about a week, and made a huge difference. Like, finally got to talk to some good psychologists, got set up for therapy. So then I go to my court hearings and stuff, ended up getting 9 months in jail, 5 years probation. I had to pay $10,000 back in restitution, getting divorced from my wife, no job at the time, hadn't gotten rehired anywhere yet or anything like that. And I applied for a job just before I went into jail, and got it up at Roof's Farm Service. And it was kind of nice because being in Darlington, although I was incarcerated in Monroe, being in Darlington, I got to drive there every day. I kind of had that time to kind of get away from everything. You can't have a lot of visitors in jail, which is why you go to jail. So I didn't have that crowd that I was running around with. And then got out of jail. There was a gal that I had been talking to before I went to jail, started seeing her. The struggle, though, that I was still having, Corey, is that I wasn't finding my own value. Like, I wasn't finding, my purpose. You read books and you watch shows, and, they say that everybody's got a purpose. Everybody's got something they're supposed to be. And I wasn't finding that. My marriage, my second marriage, was pretty toxic. I had a couple of abusive episodes with my stepson, and I remember after the second one, I went up to the babysitter who watched him during the day, and I'm like, I need some help. Like, I don't want to go down this path. I'm tired of being angry. Joey doesn't deserve that. Like, I need to get some help. So she kind of kept an eye on me. I finally got into an anger management class. So the thing that frustrated me the most back then is one of the things that still frustrates me now, is that the lack of mental health facility help is so ridiculous. If you talk to and I talked to probably 70% of the therapists in the area, some of them are out 6 months now, 6 months to 8 months to a year, and I'm like, people need this help now. This isn't something that you just shove to the back burner and then deal with it as it comes. And that's one of my biggest frustrations with all this. And so got divorced again. And then met a gal whose husband had died by suicide. We ended up getting married, being together for 16 years, got divorced. We're really good friends. We're neighbors now, which is kind of weird. I always give her a hard time that she misses me because she remarried a guy named Jeff. Super nice guy, by the way. I mean, I'm really, really happy for them. I really am. And we talk quite a bit. But right about the time that her and I were going through our divorce, I kind of got that chip on my shoulder again. Started drinking again, got way too loaded on alcohol one night, took out a took out 17 feet of a guardrail just outside of Monroe here, dropped 45 feet straight down, and was able to walk away from it.
Wow.
So that was like the third time when I think baby Jesus thumped me on the head and was like, look, dude, enough's enough. Get your crap together permanently. Get the chip off your shoulder. And since then, the day that I put on Facebook and took full accountability for my DUI was probably one of the third major turning points in my life. And I mean, I went for times, Corey, where I wouldn't drink at all, and then I'd drink like a fish, and then I wouldn't drink at all. And, it's been interesting now in the last 6.5, 7 years since my OWI, the number of people that I've seen in town, and then I'll talk to them, and then, I'll be like, so are we okay? And they're like, dude, you were a complete jackass when you were, up until the time of your OWI. You just, you weren't very nice and spouted off and that kind of stuff. And, I guess from an addiction standpoint, Corey, I'm really super happy that I didn't get involved in illicit drugs, because I help a lot of people that, do some pretty powerful drugs. And I know how hard that is, or I know how hard it is to get off alcohol, which is they say is one of the easiest drugs to get off of. So I do kind of count my blessings on that side, but that's basically, the challenging times over the last 30 years. That's kind of all of it wrapped up in a nice little nutshell.
Yeah, that's a lot. I know back in the early 90s when you had your suicide attempt, there wasn't much for mental health services, and there was a huge stigma about that, especially for men. Like you said, going to your friends, you're saying, that feelings word, talking about your feelings definitely wasn't a thing that people wanted to do back then. And even now, there's still a stigma. I think it's improving, but there's definitely a huge stigma around it as well. So I'm glad you were able to take these challenging times that you've had in your life and you've put it to good use. I know the other day I saw a post about growth in mindset, and I'm really big into kind of growth mindset. I used to be addicted to food. I lost 100 pounds after I kind of got over that addiction and all that. But addiction is really tough. And so can you talk about, excuse me, can you talk about how you took all these challenging times in your life and kind of moved past that and help? You're not fully past it, I'm sure, but and started to create TUGS. How you took all that stuff that you've gone through and put it to good use.
So I was elected as County Farm Bureau president, and I was one of the youngest presidents elected. And about 3 years into that, the Wisconsin Farm Bureau Federation had asked me to write a blog. For those of you that don't remember, blogs were these things we used to do online that were kind of like a weekly thing or whatever. Excuse me. And I wrote one on men and mental health, and they weren't going to print it. When they got it, they're like, no, we want something related to agriculture. And I'm like, this is related to agriculture. As you saw, I mentioned it there more than once. Farmers are removed. They're doing their thing out on the farm. There's a pride thing. There's, most of them are men, but there's women farmers, damn good women farmers. I'm trying to tie this all together that we need to kind of support them in their struggles because, it's hard to get off the farm. It's hard to find help. It's also hard to get off the farm to go get that kind of help. And so anyways, they're like, nope, we're still not going to print it. And I'm like, then I'm done being a Farm Bureau member. You can have I want my refund. I'm not. And so they said, well, there could be a lot of backlash from this. And I had even talked a little bit about my own stuff in there. And I'm like, what kind of backlash? Well, people are going to know that you had troubles. And I'm like, that's the whole point. That's the whole point behind this. So they finally printed it. And it went viral, and it was really interesting the amount of feedback that came out of that. And so then shortly after that was on the internet, Casey Langan, who was the Wisconsin Farm Bureau communications director at the time, he gets a hold of me and he's like, "Hey, Ditz," he goes, "my wife wants to talk to you." And I'm like, "About?" And he goes, "Well, she's got a favor to ask." He goes, I read your blog to her the other night and she was pretty moved by it and she's got a favor to ask." And I'm like, "Well, then have your wife call me. Why are we having this conversation?" And so she called me and she goes, "I was wondering if you would be interested in speaking at Madison-Dane County's Safe Communities Guys Night Out." And I'm thinking, "Whoo, guys' night out, that's like pizza and beer, and we can talk crap about our significant others and get away with it. And there's probably like a football game or something going on." Like, "Yeah, dude, I'm in." I'm like, "What do you want me to talk about?" And she goes, "Men and mental health." And I was like, "Whoa, like in person?" Like, and she's like, "Well, if you don't want to do it, I understand." I'm like, No, it's fine. I said, "I'll do it." So myself, Scott Golaxon, who's one of my best friends, my Uncle Guy, and my Uncle Guy's friend Mark, we all went up to this guy's night out. And I had wrote this 4-page speech, and I hate writing speeches, Corey. I just, I'd rather, just shoot from the hip, so to speak. And I'm reading this speech on the way up to Madison, and I said to Scott, I'm like, "I'm kind of hungry. Can we stop somewhere?" And of all places, he picks McDonald's. And so I had like 2 bites of my McDonald's cheeseburger, and I'm like, I'm just not feeling it. And I'm looking at this speech and I'm like, I'm just not feeling it. So I rip it up, crumple it up, throw it in the McDonald's bag with the rest of the trash. And my uncle's like, "Wasn't that your speech?" I'm like, "Yeah." "What are you going to talk about?" I'm like, "I don't know, but that's not it. That's not ringing with me." So we get up there. And the first thing is I walk into this huge room and there's like 30% guys and the rest are women. And I'm like, okay, what the hell? Like, nobody told me there'd be women here. Now I got to change all my jokes. That's a joke, by the way. I didn't have any bad. All my jokes are bad. But anyways, so I'm like, now I'm getting nervous because I'm like, what am I going to talk about? Like, now I got to kind of cater it a little bit different, because it's not just men up here. And they introduced me and they were talking about my Navy career. And I got up there and I was talking about things and I was talking about my Navy career. And all of a sudden it hit me, Corey. And I was like, so the ship that I was on is the second largest displacement ship next to an aircraft carrier. Actually, I think I have a picture of it here. I don't know how good you can see that. But that ship in the middle, that big ship in the middle, that's the ship that I was on. So you can kind of get a comparison of the size of it compared to the other ships that were around us. And in order for us, because of our size, we didn't really turn on a dime. We turned more like on $1.50. So when we would come into port, or we'd have to go down like locks and dams or narrow waterways, or in a worst case scenario, if you're out in the middle of the ocean and all of a sudden you go dead in the water because everything, fails on you, you would call a tugboat. And that tugboat would come out and you can't see him, but you can hear his little toot toot of his little whistle. And like going into port, they would shut everything down, and it was so quiet. We used to joke that it was so quiet you could hear the fish eating the barnacles off the outside of the boat. And you would feel this little bump, and you'd have this, before you felt the bump, you would just have this kind of a calm sense come over you because everything was so quiet. And you'd feel this little bump, and then you'd feel yourself move, and then you'd feel another little bump. And then there's this magical voice that would come across the loudspeaker that'd say, and I'm just going to paraphrase so everybody understands it, "We're safe in port," or "We're safe at home." And it hit me. It's like, why can't life be like this? Like, what if you're this big ship lost in a storm and your engines go out and you need a little help? Why can't you call a tugboat to come help? So on the way home then, I said to Scott, I'm like, dude, like, I want to start a nonprofit. And he's like, "Well, you already farm. Like, do you need another one?" And I was like, "No, like I want to start a nonprofit, and I want it to be something that doesn't have as much government regulation as farming does," which is also a lie. So anyways, I laid awake that night and I couldn't sleep and I was fidgeting and all excited. And all of a sudden it hit me, TUGS, talking, understanding. And I originally started as growth and support, but it didn't have the right ring to it. So then we changed it to growing and supporting eventually after that, because even big ships need little ships sometimes. And basically, my goal and my vision and the board's vision has been to to attack those stigmas that surround mental health. I find it interesting, Corey, that the word mental, the first three letters are men right off the bat. People that don't seem to have the ability to talk about their mental health challenges are men, veterans, farmers, and then you go right into police officers, fire department personnel, emergency response people, teachers, kids. I mean, there's a whole gamut. I mean, there's the whole stigma behind it. But those first three that I listed are the ones that struggle the most, and they're the ones that seem to have the most things going on because of that, So I went through, I tell you what, if you want to lose hair and get really gray hair, start a nonprofit. Great idea.
Sounds good.
And it's been a challenge, but it's the ability to help others with their challenges has also given me the ability to help myself with my own. So there's a kind of whole the whole Simba circle of life type thing going on there. But our biggest thing is, the biggest core value that I have for TUGS is to get people to talk about their shit. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. They just get people to talk about the things that are going on in their heads without any kind of judgment, And a TUG isn't one of those people who's going to sugarcoat things for you, Corey. A TUG is one of those people. I always tell people to try to get somebody outside of your circle who you trust, but isn't going to be, super sugarcoat. And I'll use an example. I called Scott one day and I was like, I hate my lunch. I'm having a bad day. And he's like, what? I'm like, yeah, my lunch sucks. He's like, well, what are you having for lunch? And I told him, and I said, leftovers, blah, 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 blah. And he goes, well, who packs your lunch? And I said, well, Marie packed it. I go, I can't believe she didn't pack me a better lunch. And he's like, pack your own damn lunch. And I was like, that's not what I want to hear. Like, I want you to validate that but that's that brutal honesty that you need. Like, I'm one of those people that is constantly about choices, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but I'm one of those people that's constantly about choices. Choices are yours. You can choose to pack your own lunch, or you can choose to have somebody else pack your lunch, but you need to be happy with what you have somebody else, because that's the choice you made, But then when the guy that I farm with had his brain tumor and they rushed him to the hospital, and after everything kind of settled down that day, I called Scott and I literally sobbed on the phone for 35 minutes trying to get out to him. And all he did was sit on the other end and listen. That's all he did. He didn't interject. He said to me, I called him. I said, I'm having a bad day. There's something going on with Rich. And he goes, what do you need from me? I said, I need you to just shut up and listen. Don't say anything. I need to try to get this, to make it a reality, because I was having a hard time believing it, so on and so forth. And that's all he did, is until I finally said, okay, I'm done, and then of course he asked for permission to speak. And I'm like, of course. And he's like, things will be okay. He's in good hands now, blah, 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 that whole thing. But that's the whole ideology behind what my organization is doing, and what our vision is to make those conversations normal. I said during the pandemic, when we got like 6 months into it, when things were really starting to get hammered, I says, we've had a pandemic that's been around way longer than COVID has been. The pandemic that involves mental health is not cured by vaccines. It's not cured by masks. It's not even controlled by any of that. It's controlled by us being nice to each other. If you want to change the availability of mental health providers, then be a mental health provider yourself by being a good, nice, kind, listening person. Be that person that if you see someone who looks like they're having a bad day, especially people that for sure, hey, Corey, how's it going today? You all right? You okay? And there's even a stigma about that. People, when I teach people how to do QPR, which is question, persuade, and refer, CPR for mental health, people are like, oh, I don't want to ask anybody if they're suicidal, because that's going to make them more suicidal. No, it's not. Like, all I ever wanted back before my suicide attempt was somebody to be like, hey, let's go sit in the park, grab a sandwich, and let's just talk. Tell me what's going on. I don't need you to answer everything for me. I don't need you to fix anything for me. I just need to get the stuff that's in the space in my head out of my head and have somebody, validate that. You and I sit on a park bench, Corey, and I throw all my stuff out there and you say, man, dude, that's really tough. What can I do for you? Or, man, dude, I don't have any answers, but I'm glad to listen. It's not really that hard to do. Mm-hmm. But we don't even do that much. Social media, we scroll through Facebook and, oh, Corey's going back to the gym. Way to get after it, Corey. Good job. That's awesome. Susie makes a pie. Oh, where's my invite, Susie? That looks like the best pie ever, and Jill posts pictures of her grandkids and we're like, oh, they're so cute. And somebody gets a new puppy. And then we see Billy who posts, oh, I'm just sick of everything. And then we go into each other's little instant messenger boxes and we're like, oh, Billy's being a drama llama again. What about going into Billy's message box and being like, hey, Billy, you all right? What's going on? Because maybe his sick of everything is just he had a bad day at work and he's just sick of work, or, he was working on his truck and now he needs another $100 in parts. Maybe it's nothing super major. But on the flip side of it, maybe it's, I've just had it. Like, nobody wants to listen to me. Nobody understands me. I've had enough. I'm thinking of ending my life. There is nothing wrong with asking people those questions. There is nothing wrong with saying to someone flat out, are you thinking about harming yourself? Are you thinking about dying by suicide? That conversation, honestly, Corey, is a hell of a lot easier conversation to have than to be at a visitation and facing a family, knowing that you might have been able to do something, but you didn't do anything about it at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you brought up a really big point with social media. I mean, you see, you post pictures of positive things and people are commenting and liking and blowing that kind of stuff up. But you see somebody post something where people are struggling. There's not a lot of interaction on those kind of posts. Occasionally you'll see it, but you definitely, I'm sure you see a lot more of the, like you mentioned, the instant message back and forth, like, hey, look what's going on over here, instead of reaching out to them. And that's really unfortunate. People that are struggling, that need help, people need to be willing to go and have those conversations with them to, like you said, if you can help them, then we should be doing that. So I really appreciate all the work that you're doing with TUGS. It's an incredible organization that you've put together. I know you have a board of directors that help with that as well. So it's just really remarkable, the need for this, especially in a rural agriculture-based community like Monroe, is definitely really good. So appreciate all the work you're doing with that.
Yep, I appreciate the kind words, and our work is far from done at this point. And I guess one of the other points that I want to kind of drive home too is that every day, Corey, we come in contact with people that we have no idea what's going on in their lives. The person sitting next to you at work in the cubicle could be having one of their worst days, and I always use my Quick Trip cat guy story. A few years ago, I was at Quick Trip, and you know how it is, and especially around here, Corey. Like, if I see you at Quick Trip, like, hey, Corey, how's it going? Or you just generally like, hey, how's it going? How's it going? Everybody's like, oh, it's good, it's good. And I was getting my kombucha, and there's a gentleman next to me, and I'm like, hey, how's it going? And he's like, what do you care? And I'm like, well, I asked. He goes, yeah, but do you really care? I'm like, yeah, actually, I kind of do, And he goes, well, if you really want to know, he says, I think my cat's dying. And I go, why do you think your cat's dying? And he's like, well, I feed her and she kind of eats a little bit, and then she'll drink a little bit, and then she'll like walk around and she makes this god awful noise. She's like, and I'm like, I think your cat has a hairball. And he's like, what? What's a hairball? And I'm like, it's something that cats get from cleaning themselves. And he goes, what do I need to do? And I go, well, I said, you can go to Walmart or Farm and Fleet or someplace. I said, you can get a little bottle of hairball remedy. Give it to your cat. It'll be disgusting for a couple of days. Mark my words. But I said, it'll clean out the hairball and she should be fine. He goes, what are you, a veterinarian? And I'm like, no, but I've had a lot of cats. And so we parted ways, and like 6 weeks later, I'm getting ready to get my diet Glazers, and he next thing I know, there's this hand slamming down next to me, and a credit card in, and he goes, I'm paying for this man's breakfast, and I turn around and hear it's Cat Guy, and I still to this day don't know what Cat Guy's name is because I never asked. But he goes, I need to talk to you outside. And I'm like, oh, shit, please let them have cameras outside. Like, oh, this just does not seem like a good idea. So we get outside and he goes, do you remember who I am? And I said, yeah, you're the guy with the cat. And he says, you were right. My cat had a hairball. He goes, she's doing great. And I'm like, that is awesome. Like, I am so happy to hear this. And I go, well, have a great day. And he goes, no. He says, this conversation isn't done. And I go, okay. He goes, I moved here from the East Coast for a job that the day I walked in, they told me they didn't need me anymore. Wow. He says, and here I am in this town, in this area. I don't know anybody. All I have is my cat. All my family and everybody's back east. And of course, I don't want to admit that I'm, failed or whatever. And he goes, and I told myself that very morning when I left the house that if my cat died, I was going to die with my cat.
Wow.
And I think about that literally, Corey, every morning when I wake up. I think about that throughout the day, that how many conversations do we have that we don't know that we've made an impact? And you can make a negative impact too. If you're having a crap day and you yell at the person who doesn't park quite right because they're too close to you, you don't know what's going on in their head when they park. Doesn't mean that they're a bad parker. I'm kind of a bad parker myself, but doesn't mean that they're a bad parker. It means that, something's going on and you get out and you're like, go and I try to remind myself now, after everything that I've been through, that even if I'm having a bad day, yes, there are those people that are having it worse. That doesn't make my bad day any less bad. I can validate that within myself. I don't need to listen to that toxic positivity stuff of man up or somebody's got it worse, or, oh, it's not that bad, or it could be worse, whatever. I don't need to hear any of that kind of stuff. What I need to listen to is that maybe making their day a little bit better will make my day a little better down the road.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And I think that's one of the things, I've been saying at every speech that I've given in the last 18 months, we're a society now that talks about rape, incest, all these other bad things that happen in society. And COVID, we've been talking about COVID like we're talking about chocolate milk for the last 2 years. Why can't we have that same conversation about mental health? Why can't we be that open about mental health? I think of Robin Williams and look at how happy Robin Williams seemed all the time. And I said during the pandemic too, one of the other phrases that I coined was, masks hide smiles, smiles hide depression. Mm-hmm. Why can't we talk about mental health and suicide and PTSD and bipolarism and all these other bevy of things that people have, anxiety, depression? You know what? None of those are contagious. None of those you don't need to wear a mask for or have a vaccine for. You just need to have a little kindness right here and portray that to other people. Why can't we have that conversation the way that we've been having conversations about COVID for the last 2 years?
Yeah, I'm with you. Let's break that stigma. We need to. I really like everything you said there. I'm totally with you. We need to break the stigma because there's a lot of people that struggle with mental health and just don't feel comfortable enough to open up and talk about it. So you're directing a play at the Monroe Theater Guild coming up called Right Before I Go. Can you talk about why you decided to do that and all that?
Yeah, so Right Before I Go is a play that was written in 2015 by a gentleman by the name of Stan Zimmerman. Stan is a renowned writer, actually. He wrote for the Golden Girls, the Gilmore Girls, and Roseanne. And so I was reading through it, and it's based on a true story. So Stan had a friend of his a very good friend of his that died by suicide in 2013. And when that happened, he didn't have any answers. Like Stan never had, any contact with suicide, I guess, for lack of a better term, in his life, or at least not close contact. So he started to do a bunch of research, and he found a whole bunch of letters that had been written by people that died by suicide. And so I read it, and I read it again, and I read it again, and I was like, man, this would be so cool to get this message out. Like there's a person that's bullied, there's a veteran, there's a poet, there's a daughter, there's a son, there's a gay youth. Like there is every single possible genre that you could think of in this. And so I bid it to the theater guild. They asked me quite a few questions about it because it is a pretty sensitive subject matter and stuff. And dude, we start auditions tonight. I'm super excited. We've got a lot of people auditioning. It starts off very sad, very, very dreary, very melancholy, very serious, and then turns into a message of hope at the end. I would invite everybody to come see it. I'm super, super excited about it. It's going to be powerful. It took me, honestly, Corey, probably 15, 16 times before I could ever read through it in its entirety, just because, when you think about it, when you're reading it, you're like, oh my God, these were real people. These are people that actually, Kurt Cobain's letter is in there that Courtney Love reads. There's some people from the Clinton administration. I mean, these are actual people, and it hits hard when you think about, and especially for me, like I remember those feelings. I remember writing my letter. I remember the anger. I remember the angst. I remember the sadness. I remember the peace. I remember all of those things that went along with doing that. And I want to bring that to life on stage. And I want other people to feel what those of us that struggle for mental health go through. And I'm hoping too that, maybe somebody will come and see it and it'll be a healing thing for them, and it'll make it so that they can, find some peace with their own, with some of the own things that they've been fighting. Because I tell you what, Corey, there's nothing worse than waking up every morning fighting demons in your head right from the get-go. And, you talk about addiction. I'm sure your addiction is just like my addiction, and the point that we both understand what it's like to fight that. The addiction isn't the same. I don't want you to take that away from this. I want you to take away the fact that I remember what it felt like for me to get away from my demon that was chasing me. Yours was food. Food is in front of you all the time. Man, pat yourself on the back, brother, for doing that, because there's a lot of us that don't get that ability or that strength to do that. And the other thing that I guess the other message that I want to put out with that is that, if you have beaten any of your demons, whether it be 1 or 10 or whatever, man, applaud yourself, because those are the kinds of things that those little victories are the things that are going to turn out to be huge victories, not only for you, but also for those other people that look at you. Like I saw your post about you being back at the Y, and I'm like, you know what? I need to start doing that again. Like I want to get back in and get a little healthier again. And, that way when I chase my 2-year-old granddaughter around, I'm not winded after 30 seconds or whatever. So, at the same time that we're fixing our own things, we inspire others, and that's pretty huge. And that's one of the things I definitely want to do with this play.
Yeah, that's really great. Really excited for that. And it hits the stage in June. Is that correct?
Yep. June 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. So three nighttime performances and then a Sunday matinee.
Awesome. Really excited for that. All right, Jeff, I got some rapid fire questions quickly about Wisconsin, and then we'll wrap up with one final question.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. What's your favorite restaurant in Wisconsin?
My favorite restaurant in Wisconsin?
Yeah.
Honestly, probably Swiss House.
Nice. I like it. Just off the square of Monroe. Awesome food there. What is your favorite event in Wisconsin?
Cheese days.
For sure.
Definitely cheese days.
Absolutely.
And it always takes me 2 years to recover from all the cheese that I eat anyways. And I know you said Wisconsin, and I know both of these have been Greene County, but there is nothing better than cheese days.
I agree 100%. This year's going to be pretty crazy.
Epic.
Haven't had it for a while. All right. Final rapid fire question here. Where's your favorite place to hang out in Wisconsin?
Any place that my veteran riding brothers are at, like when we do our veteran motorcycle rides, I belong to one of the veteran motorcycle. They call it a club. We call it a gang. Whatever. It's cool. But any place that's just where you can see some water, you can see some trees. I don't really have a favorite place to just sit and hang out. I do like watching my favorite softball player, number 11. So that's probably one of my favorite places too, is any place that the Monroe High School softball team is playing softball. I get a lot of enjoyment out of that. But there's so many beautiful places that I don't know that I could pick just one, dude. I really don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Wisconsin is awesome. That's why I have this podcast to talk about and share about awesome Wisconsinites and hear about some of these things. All right, so final question for you. Ask everybody on the podcast this. When all is said and done, what kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?
I want my legacy to be that people will remember me for being kind, that people will remember me for not giving up. And at the end of my time, I want my legacy to be that have inspired people to stay, because I think that's super important, that if you're thinking about leaving, there's many of us out here that want you to stay.
Absolutely. That's a really great legacy. I appreciate all the work you're doing with TUGS. You're really helping to destigmatize mental health, especially for men. Like we mentioned, there's a lot of stigma around that. Men don't like to open up, and you've created this avenue for men to open up and have that. So I really appreciate all the work you're doing with that.
I appreciate the kind words, Corey, and I will leave with the same thing that I tell everybody. It's okay to not be okay.
Yeah. If people want to follow you or reach out for anything, how would we get a hold of you?
There's a couple of ways. We do have a Facebook page. You can always go follow our Facebook page, which you have to search under Talking. You can't do it under Tugs for some reason, but you have to put in Talking and then it'll pop up. Email address is tugsgroup, TUGSGROUP @gmail.com. My phone number 608-214-9137. Those are probably the easiest ways to do that. Yeah, I think I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I do, but there's not. Those are probably the three easiest.
Sounds good. Anything else you want to add before we sign off here?
Nope. Just in a world that you can be anything, please be kind.
That's a great way to pin this up. I appreciate it, Jeff. Thanks for joining Wisco Legacy.
You bet. Thank you, Corey, and keep up the good work.
Will do. I want to thank Jeff for coming on to Wisco Legacy and sharing his story. The authenticity that Jeff has is unbelievable. He's had some trying times in his life, and I sincerely appreciate him coming on, sharing those stories, and especially appreciate the work he does with TUGS. It's incredible. If you are watching the video version on the screen here, you'll see how best to contact Jeff. If you're just listening to the audio version, you can find all that information in the show notes here. With that, thank you for tuning in to Wisco Legacy.